Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake. Dost thou love picking meat, or wouldst thou see a man in the clouds and have him speak to thee? Bunyan. Chapter 1. The Hall of the Bright Carvings. Gormenghast, that is, the main massing of the original stone, taken by itself would have displayed a certain ponderous architectural quality were it possible to have ignored the circumfusion of those mean dwellings that swarmed like an epidemic around its outer walls. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbor, until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels laid hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like limpets to a rock. These dwellings, by ancient law, were granted this chill intimacy with the stronghold that loomed above them. Over their irregular roofs would fall throughout the seasons the shadows of time-eaten buttresses, of broken and lofty turrets, and, most enormous of all, the shadow of the Tower of Flints. This tower, patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fists of knuckled masonry and pointed blasphemously at heaven. At night the owls made of it an echoing throat. By day it stood voiceless and cast its long shadow. Very little communication passed between the denizens of these outer quarters and those who lived within the walls, save when, on the first June morning of each year, the entire population of the clay dwellings had sanction to enter the grounds in order to display the wooden carvings on which they had been working during the year. These carvings, blazoned in strange color, were generally of animals or figures and were treated in a highly stylized manner peculiar to themselves. The competition among them to display the finest object of the year was bitter and rabid. Their sole passion was directed, once their days of love had guttered, on the production of this wooden sculpture, and among the muddle of huts at the foot of the outer wall existed a score of creative craftsmen whose position as leading carvers gave them pride of place among the shadows. At one point within the outer wall, a few feet from the earth, the great stones of which the wall itself was constructed jutted forward in the form of a massive shelf stretching from east to west for about 200 to 300 feet. These protruding stones were painted white, and it was upon this shelf that on the first morning of June the carvings were ranged every year for judgment by the Earl of Groan. Those works judged to be the most consummate, and there were never more than 3 chosen, were subsequently relegated to the Hall of the Bright Carvings. Standing immobile throughout the day, these vivid objects, with their fantastic shadows on the wall behind them shifting and elongating hour by hour with the sun's rotation, exuded a kind of darkness for all their color. The air between them was turgid with contempt and jealousy. The craftsmen stood about like beggars, their families clustered in silent groups. They were uncouth and prematurely aged, all radiance gone. The carvings that were left unselected were burned the same evening in the courtyard below Lord Groan's western balcony, and it was customary for him to stand there at the time of the burning and to bow his head silently as if in pain, and then as a gong beat thrice from within, the 3 carvings to escape the flames would be brought forth in the moonlight. There they were stood upon the balustrade of the balcony in full view of the crowd below, and the Earl of Groan would call for their authors to come forward. When they had stationed themselves immediately beneath where he was standing, the Earl would throw down to them the traditional scrolls of vellum, which, as the writings upon them verified, permitted these men to walk the battlements above their cantonment at the full moon of each alternate month. On these particular nights, from a window in the southern wall of Gormenghast, an observer might watch the minute moonlit figures whose skill had won for them this honor which they so coveted, moving to and fro among the battlements. Saving this exception of the day of carvings, and the latitude permitted to the most peerless, there was no other opportunity for those who lived within the walls to know these outer folk, nor in fact were they of interest to the inner world, being submerged within the shadows of the great walls. They were all but forgotten people, the breed that was remembered with a start, or with the unreality of a recrudescent dream. The day of carvings alone brought them into the sunlight and reawakened the memory of former times, for as far back as even Nettle, the octogenarian who lived in the tower above the rusting armory, could remember, the ceremony had been held. Innumerable carvings had smoldered to ashes in obedience to the law, but the choicest were still housed in the hall of the bright carvings. This hall, which ran along the top story of the north wing, was presided over by the curator, Rotcod, who, as no one ever visited the room, slept during most of his life in the hammock he had erected at the far end. For all his dozing, he had never been known to relinquish the feather duster from his grasp, the duster with which he would perform one of the only two regular tasks which appeared to be necessary in that long and silent hall, namely to flick the dust from the bright carvings. As objects of beauty, these works held little interest to him, and yet in spite of himself he had become attached in a propinquital way to a few of the carvings. He would be more than thorough when dusting the emerald horse. The black and olive head which faced it across the boards and the piebald shark were also his especial care. Not that there were any on which the dust was allowed to settle. Entering at 7 o'clock, winter and summer, year in and year out, Rotcod would disengage himself of his jacket and draw over his head a long grey overall which descended shapelessly to his ankles. With his feather duster tucked beneath his arm, it was his habit to peer sagaciously over his glasses down the length of the hall. His skull was dark and small like a corroded musket bullet, and his eyes behind the gleaming of his glasses were the twin miniatures of his head. All three were constantly on the move, as though to make up for the time they spent asleep, the head wobbling in a mechanical way from side to side when Mr. Rotcod walked, and the eyes, as though taking their cue from the parent sphere to which they were attached, peering here, there, and everywhere at nothing in particular. Having peered quickly over his glasses on entering, and having repeated the performance along the length of the north wing after enveloping himself in his overall, it was the custom of Rotcod to relieve his left armpit of the feather duster, and with that weapon raised, to advance towards the first of the carvings on his right-hand side, without more ado. Being at the top floor of the north wing, this hall was not in any real sense a hall at all, but was more in the nature of a loft. The only window was at its far end, and opposite the door through which Rotcod would enter from the upper body of the building. It gave little light. The shutters were invariably lowered. The hall of the bright carvings was illuminated night and day by 7 great candelabra suspended from the ceiling at intervals of 9 feet. The candles were never allowed to fail or even to gutter, Rotcod himself seeing to their replenishment before retiring at 9 o'clock in the evening. There was a stock of white candles in the small dark ante-room beyond the door of the hall, where also were kept ready for use Rotcod's overall, a huge visitor's book, white with dust, and a step-ladder. There were no chairs or tables, nor indeed any furniture save the hammock at the window end where Mr. Rotcod slept. The boarded floor was white with dust which, so assiduously kept from the carvings, had no alternative resting place and had collected deep and ash-like, accumulating especially in the 4 corners of the hall. Having flicked at the first carving on his right, Rotcod would move mechanically down the long phalanx of color, standing a moment before each carving, his eyes running up and down it and all over it, and his head wobbling knowingly on his neck before he introduced his feather duster. Rotcod was unmarried. An aloofness and even a nervousness was apparent on first acquaintance, and the ladies held a peculiar horror for him. His, then, was an ideal existence, living alone day and night in a long loft. Yet occasionally, for one reason or another, a servant or a member of the household would make an unexpected appearance, and startle him with some question appertaining to ritual, and then the dust would settle once more in the hall and on the soul of Mr. Rotcod. What were his reveries as he lay in his hammock with his dark bullet head tucked into the crook of his arm? What would he be dreaming of, hour after hour, year after year? It is not easy to feel that any great thoughts haunted his mind, nor, in spite of the sculpture whose bright files surged over the dust in narrowing perspective like the highway for an emperor, that Rotcod made any attempt to avail himself of his isolation, but rather that he was enjoying the solitude for its own sake, with, at the back of his mind, the dread of an intruder. One humid afternoon a visitor did arrive to disturb Rotcod as he lay deeply hammocked, for his siesta was broken sharply by a rattling of the door handle, which was apparently performed in lieu of the more popular practice of knocking at the panels. The sound echoed down the long room and then settled into the fine dust on the boarded floor. The sunlight squeezed itself between the thin cracks of the window blind. Even on a hot, stifling, unhealthy afternoon such as this, the blinds were down and the candlelight filled the room with an incongruous radiance. At the sound of the door handle being rattled, Rotcod sat up suddenly. The thin bands of moted light edging their way through the shutters barred his dark head with the brilliance of the outer world. As he lowered himself over the hammock, it wobbled on his shoulders, and his eyes darted up and down the door, returning again and again after their rapid and precipitous journeys to the agitations of the door handle. Gripping his feather duster in his right hand, Rotcod began to advance down the bright avenue, his feet giving rise at each step to little clouds of dust. When he had at last reached the door, the handle had ceased to vibrate. Lowering himself suddenly to his knees, he placed his right eye at the keyhole, and controlling the oscillation of his head and the vagaries of his left eye, which was forever trying to dash up and down the vertical surface of the door, he was able by dint of concentration to observe, within 3 inches of his keyholed eye, an eye which was not his, being not only of a different color to his own iron marble, but being, which is more convincing, on the other side of the door. This third eye, which was going through the same performance as the one belonging to Rotcod, belonged to Flay, the taciturn servant of Sepulchrave, Earl of Gormenghast. For Flay to be 4 rooms horizontally or 1 floor vertically away from his lordship was a rare enough thing in the castle. For him to be absent at all from his master's side was abnormal, yet here apparently on this stifling summer afternoon was the eye of Mr. Flay at the outer keyhole of the Hall of the Bright Carvings, and presumably the rest of Mr. Flay was joined on behind it. On mutual recognition the eyes withdrew simultaneously, and the brass doorknob rattled again in the grip of the visitor's hand. Rotcod turned the key in the lock, and the door opened slowly. Mr. Flay appeared to clutter up the doorway as he stood revealed, his arms folded, surveying the smaller man before him in an expressionless way. It did not look as though such a bony face as his could give normal utterance, but rather that instead of sounds, something more brittle, more ancient, something drier would emerge, something perhaps more in the nature of a splinter or a fragment of stone. Nevertheless, the harsh lips parted. "It's me," he said, and took a step forward into the room, his knee joints cracking as he did so. His passage across the room, in fact his passage through life, was accompanied by these cracking sounds, one per step, which might be likened to the breaking of dry twigs. Rotcod, seeing that it was indeed he, motioned him to advance by an irritable gesture of the hand, and closed the door behind him. Conversation was never one of Mr. Flay's accomplishments, and for some time he gazed mirthlessly ahead of him, and then, after what seemed an eternity to Rotcod, he raised a bony hand and scratched himself behind the ear. Then he made his second remark. "Still here, eh?" he said, his voice forcing its way out of his face. Rotcod, feeling presumably that there was little need to answer such a question, shrugged his shoulders and gave his eyes the run of the ceiling. Mr. Flay pulled himself together and continued. "I said still here, eh, Rotcod?" He stared bitterly at the carving of the emerald horse. "You're still here, eh?" "I'm invariably here," said Rotcod, lowering his gleaming glasses and running his eyes all over Mr. Flay's visage. Day in, day out, invariably. Very hot weather. Extremely stifling. Did you want anything? Nothing, said Flay as he turned towards Rotcod with something menacing in his attitude. I want nothing. He wiped the palms of his hands on his hips where the dark cloth shone like silk. Rotcod flicked ash from his shoes with the feather duster and tilted his bullet head. Ah, he said in a non-committal way. You say ah, said Flay, turning his back on Rotcod and beginning to walk down the colored avenue. But I tell you, it is more than ah. Of course, said Rotcod. Much more, I dare say, but I fail to understand. I am a curator. At this he drew his body up to full height and stood on the tips of his toes in the dust. A what? Said Flay, straggling above him, for he had returned. A curator? That is so, said Rotcod, shaking his head. Flay made a hard noise in his throat. To Rotcod it signified a complete lack of understanding, and it annoyed him that the man should invade his province. Curator, said Flay, after a ghastly silence. I will tell you something. I know something. Eh? Well, said Rotcod. I'll tell you, said Flay. But first, what day is it? What month and what year is it? Answer me. Rotcod was puzzled at this question, but he was becoming a little intrigued. It was so obvious that the bony man had something on his mind, and he replied, It is the 8th day of the 8th month. I am uncertain about the year. But why? In a voice almost inaudible, Flay repeated, The 8th day of the 8th month. His eyes were almost transparent, as though in a country of ugly hills one were to find among the harsh rocks 2 sky-reflecting lakes. Come here, he said. Come closer, Rotcod, I will tell you. You don't understand Gormenghast, what happens in Gormenghast, the things that happen. No, no. Below you, that's where it all is. Under this north wing. What are these things up here? These wooden things. No use now. Keep them, but no use now. Everything is moving. The castle is moving. Today, first time for years, he's alone, his lordship. Not in my sight. Flay bit at his knuckle. Bedchamber of ladyship, that's where he is. Lordship is beside himself. Won't have me, won't let me in to see the new one. The new one. He's come. He's downstairs. I haven't seen him. Flay bit at the corresponding knuckle on the other hand, as though to balance the sensation. No one's been in. Of course not. I'll be next. The birds are lined along the bed rail. Ravens, starlings, all the perishers and the white rook. There's a kestrel claws through the pillow. My lady feeds them with crusts, grain and crusts. Hardly sees her newborn. Heir to Gormenghast. Doesn't look at him. But my lord keeps staring. Seen him through the grating. Needs me. Won't let me in. Are you listening? Mr. Rotcod certainly was listening. In the first place, he had never heard Mr. Flay talk so much in his life before, and in the second place, the news that a son had been born at long last to the ancient and historic house of Groan was, after all, an interesting titbit for a curator living alone on the upper story of the desolate north wing. Here was something with which he could occupy his mind for some time to come. It was true, as Mr. Flay pointed out, that he, Rotcod, could not possibly feel the pulse of the castle as he lay in his hammock, for in point of fact, Rotcod had not even suspected that an heir was on its way. His meals came up in a miniature lift through darkness from the servants' quarters many floors below, and he slept in the ante-room at night, and consequently he was completely cut off from the world and all its happenings. Flay had brought him real news. All the same, he disliked being disturbed, even when information of this magnitude was brought. What was passing through the bullet-shaped head was a question concerning Mr. Flay's entry. Why had Flay, who never in the normal course of events would have raised an eyebrow, to acknowledge his presence? Why had he now gone to the trouble of climbing to a part of the castle so foreign to him, and to force a conversation on a personality as unexpansive as his own? He ran his eyes over Mr. Flay in his own peculiarly rapid way, and surprised himself by saying suddenly, "To what may I attribute your presence, Mr. Flay?" "What?" said Flay. "What's that?" He looked down on Rotcod, and his eyes became glassy. In truth, Mr. Flay had surprised himself. Why, indeed, he thought to himself, had he troubled to tell Rotcod the news which meant so much to him? Why Rotcod, of all people? He continued staring at the curator for some while, and the more he stood and pondered, the clearer it became to him that the question he had been asked was, to say the very least, uncomfortably pertinent. The little man in front of him had asked a simple and forthright question. It had been rather a poser. He took a couple of shambling steps towards Mr. Rotcod, and then, forcing his hands into his trouser pockets, turned round very slowly on one heel. "Ah," he said at last.
"I see what you mean, Rotcod, I see what you mean."
Rotcod was longing to get back to his hammock and enjoy the luxury of being quite alone again, but his eye travelled even more speedily towards the visitor's face when he heard the remark. Mr. Flay had said that he saw what Rotcod had meant. Had he really? Very interesting. What, by the way, had he meant? What precisely was it that Mr. Flay had seen? He flicked an imaginary speck of dust from the gilded head of a dryad. "You are interested in the birth below?" he inquired. Flay stood for a while as though he had heard nothing, but after a few minutes it became obvious he was thunderstruck.
"Interested?"
he cried in a deep, husky voice.
"Interested? The child is a groan! An authentic male groan, challenged to change. No change, Rotcod, no change."
"Ah," said Rotcod, "I see your point, Mr. Flay, but his lordship was not dying."
"No,"
said Mr. Flay.
"He was not dying, but teeth lengthen."
And he strode to the wooden shutters with long, slow, heron-like paces, and the dust rose behind him. When it had settled, Rotcod could see his angular, parchment-colored head leaning itself against the lintel of the window. Mr. Flay could not feel entirely satisfied with his answer to Rotcod's question covering the reason for his appearance in the Hall of the Bright Carvings. As he stood there by the window, the question repeated itself to him again and again. Why Rotcod? Why on earth Rotcod? And yet he knew that directly he had heard of the birth of the heir, when his dour nature had been stirred so violently that he had found himself itching to communicate his enthusiasm to another being. From that moment Rotcod had leapt to his mind. Never of a communicative or enthusiastic nature, he had found it difficult, even under the emotional stress of the Advent, to inform Rotcod of the facts. And, as has been remarked, he had surprised even himself, not only for having unburdened himself at all, but for having done so in so short a time. He turned, and saw that the curator was standing wearily by the piebald shark, his small cropped round head moving to and fro like a bird's, and his hands clasped before him, with the feather duster between his fingers. He could see that Rotcod was politely waiting for him to go. Altogether, Mr. Flay was in a peculiar state of mind. He was surprised at Mr. Rotcod for being so unimpressed at the news, and he was surprised at himself for having brought it. He took from his pocket a vast watch of silver, and held it horizontally on the flat of his palm.
"Must go,"
he said awkwardly.
"Do you hear me, Rotcod? I must go."
"Good of you to call," said Rotcod. "Will you sign your name in the visitor's book as you go out?"
"No, not a visitor."
Flay brought his shoulders up to his ears.
Been with Lordship 37 years. Sign a book,"
he added contemptuously, and he spat into a far corner of the room. "As you wish," said Mr. Rotcod. "It was to the section of the visitor's book devoted to staff that I was referring."
"No,"
said Flay. As he passed the curator on his way to the door, he looked carefully at him as he came abreast, and the question rankled. Why? The castle was filled with the excitement of the nativity. All was alive with conjecture. There was no control. Rumor swept through the stronghold. Everywhere, in passage, archway, cloister, refectory, kitchen, dormitory, and hall, it was the same. Why had he chosen the unenthusiastic Rotcod? And then, in a flash, he realized. He must have subconsciously known that the news would be new to no one else, that Rotcod was virgin soil for his message. Rotcod the curator, who lived alone among the bright carvings, was the only one on whom he could vent the tidings without jeopardizing his sullen dignity, and to whom, although the knowledge would give rise to but little enthusiasm, it would at least be new. Having solved the problem in his mind, and having realized in a dullish way that the conclusion was particularly mundane and uninspired, and that there was no question of his soul calling along the corridors and up the stairs to the soul of Rotcod, Mr. Flay, in a thin, straddling manner, moved along the passages of the north wing and down the curve of stone steps that led to the stone quadrangle, feeling the while a curious disillusion, a sense of having suffered a loss of dignity, and a feeling of being thankful that his visit to Rotcod had been unobserved, and that Rotcod himself was well hidden from the world in the hall of the bright carvings.